Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal Podcast. As you probably know by now, earlier this month, Apple and Google announced a major multi year deal for Google's Gemini AI models. That's very interesting news. So, we're going to talk a little bit about that, but I'm going to take this opportunity to socialize a little bit more about the mobile market as well. So, we know what this means in the next 6 months to a year, or probably going forward for the next many years. So, if that might be something of interest to you, stay put and just watch, and hopefully you learn a couple of things that you don't already know and enjoy this monologue in the process. So without further ado, let's get started here. But just one quick thing before we get started. Snowpal provides a number of products. One of our products is a B2B offering, a rich suite of APIs available on AWS Marketplace. So our APIs can be integrated very easily. It takes no more than 5 minutes for you to subscribe on AWS Marketplace and have your dev team start coding to it. So leveraging the current set of AI tools that are available out there in the market, with our APIs, you're going to be able to build any software in really, really quick time and save a lot of time and money and risk and whatnot. So check us out. Go to aws.snowpal.com. It's going to redirect you to the AWS Marketplace. But if you want to deploy our APIs in your own infrastructure, you're welcome to do that as well. We sell commercial licenses. They start at about $5,000. They're very cheap, so it's going to save you a lot of time and money and many other things, right? So check us out. So that's it for the quick the plug there. Now let's get into the topic. So Apple and Google announced this deal. What does it mean, right? So a little bit of a background. I've created a few diagrams I'm going to share some illustrations along the way. Um, there's a number of things I want to talk about here. But at the offset, let me say this again. Apple is a hardware slash software company, right? It was for the longest of times the largest company in the world. It's just behind Nvidia right now, a $4 trillion company, or maybe just under $4 trillion. Right? I'm not sure. But regardless, right? They are one of the largest companies. I mean, again, I'm saying the same thing one more time. They are a huge company. They are an incredible software company, as we all know. So it's kind of sad if you think about it, that they actually have to now. I mean, as good as Google or Alphabet is, uh, the fact that Apple has to rely on another software company to actually get stuff done is just not something that any of us or a lot of us might have anticipated if it asked us like a year or two ago, or maybe even a few years earlier. But in the last many years, we've got accustomed to Apple being still a good company, but not being particularly creative or progressive when it comes to technologies in many ways. They've kind of sat out. They've so far it's looked like they sat out the AI revolution. There's a lot of talk about whether AI is hype and this or that, but I think at this point it's safe to say that AI is anything but hype. Right? It's going to have its ups and downs in terms of how the market reacts to a lot of these changes, but it's here to stay lock, stock, and barrel. Right? At least a good number of people, including me, believe that that is to be the case. Given that, and if that, let's say you belong to that school of thought, which you might agree that Apple has lagged behind there, right? Early, like in 2 years ago, right? Somewhere in 2024, they announced Apple Intelligence. If my memory serves me right, it was around that time frame that they mentioned in Apple Intelligence, and they called it AI, but not like artificial intelligence, but they said Apple Intelligence. And one of the main things one of the biggest features, at least if I remember correctly, was the improvements that they were going to make Siri, which had very little improvement, if any, over the last decade or so. So it was very exciting, right? What it could potentially do. They even released an ad that they pulled back later because they failed to deliver on what the ad had promised, and it was very misleading. So I think it was like Apple 16 or something around that time, but it just did not happen. Fast forward 2 years, you hear the news comes out that and it's been in the works for a while, but they've officially announced this, right? Both companies, that they're going to be partnering, working together. Now, what this actually means from a technology standpoint, I mean, it's still unclear, because it could mean one of many things, right? I mean, at least here is how I see it with my little understanding. Or here are my questions, I should say. is Alphabet. Let's call it Google for this, just because it's easier to say Google, but it's synonymous. It's the parent company. So is Google going to be providing AI models for Apple to sort of use in white label, meaning they buy Google's Gemini models and then build their own services on top of that, essentially. So Apple's going to have their own AI team, obviously, but they're going to essentially purchase or find a way to buy these models, AI models from Alphabet or Google, and then they're going to resell that by doing value add on top of that, essentially, right? So Siri is going to leverage the Gemini model, but it's for all practical purposes to the end user. It's on the iPhone and it's transparent, and Apple, excuse me, is adding many layers or some layers on top of that. That's one way to go about it. Now, there's many ways to skin this cat. Obviously, these are multi-trillion-dollar companies. So here is me just speculating what I think the two ends of that spectrum could potentially be. So this is one end. The other end, the way I see it at least, is potentially Google and Apple could work together very closely, where Google becomes a service provider, if you will, for anything that is Siri dependent. So in other words, they power Siri. Now, this whole thing could be most likely is not most likely. I think Apple even mentioned that it's going to run on their data centers. From a security standpoint, what they call it, the Apple, is it the private compute? I forget what it is. Let me search here. Maybe it's Apple. Yeah, Apple private cloud compute, right? That's what they call it. So it could be running, most likely, I'm definitely, most definitely, it probably will be running in the Apple data centers under Apple private cloud compute. But regardless, maybe it's powered very closely by Google, meaning they are working with the team at Google as though they are a managed service provider or something of that nature. I mean, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but that's the other end of the spectrum, if you ask me. For any other company, that's an option, but for a company of Apple's size and stature, that might not make any sense, right? Not much, but maybe not any sense at all. But I don't know. So that's the way I see two different options. We don't know where it is, and there's probably many different other solutions that are out there. I don't know if they've actually announced it. I don't think so, as to what that collaboration is actually going to look like. But it should suffice to say that Apple is going to be dependent on Google for powering Siri. Well, whether that's like for the near term, short term, long term, or forever, I don't know, right? Only time has to tell. But the fact that that's happening means Apple's kind of acknowledged the fact that they have lost that race, if you will, to some extent at least, right? At least at this point of time, at the time of this recording. That's very interesting. That's very interesting, and it changes a number of things. And I put together a diagram showing the dependencies, interdependencies between these two companies and some other companies, the hyperscalers as well. I think you might appreciate that diagram. So we'll just go to that in a second. So that's the background to what I want to share. Let's see what this means. What we look at some numbers, income and revenue, and how all of this changes the future of at least that part of Apple's business, essentially. A couple of interesting numbers to note. I think Apple's net income, the earnings last year, 2025, was I believe like $112 billion or something along those lines, right? So that's the number. Keep that in mind, and I'll tell you why I mentioned that quickly. Okay, so let me go to what do I have next here. I can close. Yeah, here is a diagram I have. Let's look at this. Maybe I'll make it a little bit smaller. Oops, that's too small. I'm gonna make it 70%. Oh, okay, let me refresh the page here. Oops, I was just worried for a second if that diagram had vanished. No, okay. Okay, hopefully you can see this. I wanted to, yeah, well, maybe I'll make it a little bit smaller, maybe. That's all right. I think we'll work our way through this diagram here. Let me close all of these guys. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to make it fit to screen. I think it's a little too small there. Sorry, this should take less than the time it's taking. Anyways, we look at this. So I put a bunch of four companies, not a bunch, not all of the hyperscalers, but as you can see here, you have Microsoft, Apple, Alphabet, Amazon. I also have OpenAI in the mix here. We'll take a look at that as well. But let's see, we're talking about the partnership between Alphabet and Apple. But I think to get the bigger picture, it does help to know the relationship that these companies have, how they work with each other. Now, sure, they are competitors as well, right? Each one competes with the other in many different forms and shapes, but they are also partners in other ways, right? So that's what we're going to take a quick look at here. I'm sharing a diagram here that explains the relationship between some of the hyperscalers. It doesn't have all of them like you see here, but it does have Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, and Alphabet. It also has OpenAI. It's an important player. When you're talking about AI, surely OpenAI is one of the most important players. I mean, they started this whole revolution, I think, if I'm not wrong. But in the context of this conversation, that's very important as well. So while we're talking about the relationship between Apple and Alphabet in the context of that particular deal, Siri and Gemini models powering Siri, I think it is relevant to understand the slightly bigger picture. So Apple probably makes 40 to 50% of their revenue through iPhones, somewhere around that number, right? That's their biggest breadwinner. Now they have a number of other products and services. They have iPads, the MacBook, the AirPods, and a number of other products. But iPhone is where they make most of their money, right? And then they're making a good amount of money through their services in the last many years. But iPhone, as we all know, is literally the most important offering from an Apple standpoint. Uh, from a revenue standpoint, also from the impact that they have overall in the market. So we will look at phones. We look at the market share for different phones, Android phones, iPhones in the US and across the globe, because that'll give us a bit more context again to this deal, right? Again, the reason I mentioned that is while Siri can be used on other Apple devices, uh, for the for all practical purposes, given that 50%, close to 50% of Apple's revenue is coming from iPhone, we are going to keep our focus to Siri that's running on the mobile device, on iPhones. In that context, you can see the diagram here that Apple, one of their products is iPhone, and one of the features that iPhone has is Siri, and now Siri is going to be powered by Google Gemini, which is provided by Alphabet. So that's the relationship between those two companies in this context. Now, the cost from what I'm seeing, I wish that this toolbar didn't show up. I don't know there's a way to get rid of it, but it's okay. So I don't know if, I don't know what the actual number is, but I read that anywhere the amount of money that Apple's going to be giving Alphabet for this particular collaboration or partnership is going to be about $1 billion a year to $1 to $5 billion annually. Now, I don't know where they are, what the number exactly is going to be, but that's the range. So let's go with the higher end, $5 billion. And I don't know if that's dependent on the number of Apple devices that Apple actually sells, at Apple iPhones, or let's keep this simple. Let's say it's agnostic to the number of iPhones that Apple sells, which probably is going to be the case. Uh, it's $5 billion in revenue lost for Apple, and it's $5 billion in revenue gained for Alphabet if this deal happens to go through. Now, there could be antitrust issues and other things. I don't know if they come into play, but let's say if it goes through, that's how much money Alphabet is going to make from Apple from this single deal. Let's also remember that Alphabet is actually paying $20 billion a year to Apple to actually have Google as the default search engine on iPhones. That's been going, they've been paying them for a while. And now that Alphabet won the antitrust case like a few months ago, and you can see it's reflected very clearly in their stock prices. So they're paying them $20 billion, and Apple now ends up paying $5 billion to Alphabet if that ends up being the case. So the net is going to be $15 billion gain for Alphabet essentially, right? So that's between the two. They are two unrelated services, even though they both relate to the mobile device iPhone. But for the purpose of this conversation, they are different. But remember that it's $5 billion. Let's take that as a number. Now let's see what are the relationships I've documented here. Let's see. We'll come to Amazon most likely at the very end. Let's talk about Apple Cloud Compute. This is the private cloud compute. So Apple's promising the same levels of security, even if they end up leveraging Google's Gemini models to power Siri essentially. So it's going to be running on Apple data centers, from what I understand. So it'll be under that umbrella of Apple Private Cloud Compute. So I have the arrow here from Siri to Cloud Compute, and the arrow goes from iPhone to Google Gemini as well. So that's that part of the relationship. Let's talk about iCloud. You know what? It's not directly related to this. I just want to put that there to showcase the broader relationship. But since we're talking Apple, maybe we can talk about that and be done with that part of the diagram. iCloud is Apple's one of Apple's services. A lot of people in the US are paying for it. Um, so iCloud is running primarily on Apple data centers, but not exclusively. I mean, I did not know that. I thought it was exclusively on Apple data centers, but apparently that's not the case. So Apple iCloud runs mainly or predominantly on Apple's data centers, but it also leverages, as you can see the arrow here, AWS, Amazon Web Services. It leverages Google Cloud, and it seems to also be leveraging the Azure, Microsoft Azure infrastructure. Now, as to what the split is, I don't know, and it's probably not important for this conversation. So that's the dependency that Apple has on the other three hyperscaler and on three of the other three hyperscalers there. Um, just remember that for what it's worth. Um, let's go to Microsoft for a second. So Microsoft, Google, and Amazon and AWS are the three largest cloud providers, pretty much. I don't know the exact number of the market. I don't remember the number of the market when it comes to the market share, but as AWS is number one, maybe 30, upwards of 30%. I think following that it's Azure, and then I think it's Google Cloud if I'm not wrong. Right, that's the split. Azure probably is 20%. They've done a lot of catching up over the years, and maybe Google Cloud is like 15% or so. Don't quote me on this. That's what I think the numbers are, but you can check them yourself. So in this diagram here, Microsoft's Azure infrastructure, you can see that. Let's now switch gears to the relationship between OpenAI and Microsoft. They are partners in many ways. Microsoft's investing heavily on OpenAI, and they work well together, or they work closely together, I should say. OpenAI is the company behind ChatGPT, which we all know. They have incredible, AI models. I listed a couple of them here: 4o, GPT-5, and so on. Now they have a layer atop that, which are the model APIs, which a lot of us, companies like Snowball and other companies will be consuming to leverage the OpenAI models. Now those model APIs they run on the Azure infrastructure, right? So that's dependency directly. OpenAI has its own models, and those models have APIs on top of them that a lot of us are consuming and leveraging and integrating. Those APIs run on the Azure infrastructure. That's the relationship between Microsoft and OpenAI. That's one of the facets of that relationship. Now, Microsoft also has, a lot of workloads, like SQL Server and Windows and whatnot. Those run on their own data centers on the Azure infrastructure. Again, probably primarily and predominantly, I should assume, but they also have them available on AWS. So, AWS customers can use SQL Server and Windows and all of the other Microsoft products as well. So that's the relationship between Microsoft and Azure. So in one way, they compete with each other on the cloud services that they provide, because they have competing offerings, right? You could be on AWS or Azure, or both as well. But all of them, they have competing offerings for the most part. At the same time, Microsoft has its workloads running on AWS, so AWS customers can use that. I don't think there's a relationship in the other direction where AWS depends on Microsoft, at least not that I know of. Now, Amazon also has something called interconnect, which basically is, if I just do a AWS interconnect. So let's say I'm just going to read off of their documentation. It says, let's say I'm sharing my screen, right? AWS Interconnect is a managed private connectivity service. It enables you to create high-speed network connections between your AWS clouds and your VPCs on other public clouds. They say other public clouds, but I know that this has a, this has a very, I don't know how many other clouds they work closely with, but I know that Microsoft is certainly one of them. So there is a clear mapping between, the AWS locations, centers, and Azure on the other side. So you can map AWS, say Virginia, to maybe somewhere. Let's actually look at it. AWS interconnect Azure mappings. I'm just going to try this search to see if it pulls up something. Well, this talks about the service mappings, but that's not what I was looking at. Interconnect Azure mappings by region. Yeah, this is what I was looking for. You see here, AWS region is US East 1, Northern Virginia, East 2 is Ohio, and then it's mapped to a certain other, Azure region. So this, it's very interesting in the context of interconnect, because rather than all of these mappings happen outside and take something that the end users, the clients, would have otherwise needed to worry about, with the interconnect, they don't have to worry about it. And these mappings work a lot more seamlessly, right, between services running on two different cloud providers. Now that's very interesting, but that's outside the scope of this conversation. I just mentioned that because I have I just happen to have mention about it here on the diagram to show you the relationship between Amazon and, I think I pointed it to. Hang on, did I point it to Google Cloud as opposed to Azure? Yeah, I think this arrow is. Let me go. You know what? Let me actually go fix it, because um, now maybe it's there with Google Cloud as well, but I think I wanted to mention Azure specifically. Yep, right. And isn't that what we just saw? AWS interconnect Azure mappings, right? That's what we had seen. I just want to make sure. So that's what it is, right? So that's the relationship between Amazon and Microsoft in this example here, where both their cloud services can work seamlessly. Now, again, just to re-emphasize the point I made earlier, while they do compete in many different ways, forms, and shapes, there are numerous places of intersection and collaboration as well. So these large companies, these really, really large companies, do work with each other, help each other, and benefit from each other as much as they compete with each other. Something to keep in mind. Okay, what else did I miss? Anything else here? We talked about. I just want to make sure I covered all of these objects. Apple iCloud, iPhone, Siri, Apple Cloud Compute, Alphabet, Gemini, Google Cloud, OpenAI, models, model APIs, Microsoft workloads. I think that at least gives you an overview of relationships. Now, if you add more other hyperscalers into the mix here, there can be more arrows that go from one side to the other. But I think that's good. That gives us a pretty good picture about what I was hoping to socialize with you folks here. Okay, now that we have done that, let's come back for a second to this item and then switch gears. So, what does it mean for revenue, right? So, we're talking about Apple and Google collaborating, partnering with the Google powering the Siri functionality on Apple phones, iPhones, and other devices, but primarily iPhones for this conversation. So, let's get an idea of what the split is between iPhones, the iOS operating system, and Android phones overall in US, but also across the globe. So I put together some pie charts here. Let's go through them quickly, because I think they're rather interesting, and they make a point here. So the global smartphone market share, if you look at it, it's Apple. Let you know what. Hold your thought for a second there. Let's look at Apple iPhone market share in US. Yeah, it's over 50%, as you can see here, right? It's over 50%. That's what I thought. So when it comes to the US, Apple has more than a 50% market share on mobile devices. That's an incredibly big number. And for the largest economy in the world, if you imagine that that company has more than 50% of the mobile market share, one of the most popular devices, if not the most popular device today and for the last many years, has been a phone. since the launch of the iPhone. So, with the most popular device on everyone's hands and with us at all times, and in a market that where it, and in a country that which is happens to be the largest GDP, have the largest GDP in the world, you happen to have a more than a 50% market share. So if you put all of those things together, you can see the magnitude of the numbers we're talking about here. But if you take the overall market share, Apple's at 20%. If you take the rest of the world, every other country in the world put together, so the number drops from a 50% market share in the US to 20%. So that's a significant drop. But remember, that's across the globe. So it's a pretty big number. And you'll recognize the size of that number when I say this next sentence, which is according to the numbers that I pulled up here, the next highest market share is held by Samsung, the South Korean company, and it's under Apple's market share, right? So Samsung is the largest player on the Android market, and in the overall phone market, pretty much, right? But they are right below Apple. Now, those numbers, I don't know how accurate they are. They could change. They does change all the time. Let's say they are at least as much as Apple, if not, maybe slightly lesser than Apple. So that tells you how big the iPhone market share is across the globe. And if you look at the other ones there, Xiaomi, hopefully I'm pronouncing that name correctly, XIAOMI, Xiaomi or something around there, the pronunciation, 13%, Vivo, 8%, Oppo, 8%. So 8 plus 8, 16, plus 13 is 29%. So those are three big Chinese companies, 29% market share. So if we put them together, they beat Apple and Samsung independently, but collectively, right? So Chinese phone companies collectively surely have a lot more market share than Apple or Samsung. But independently, Apple's the number one, Samsung is two, Xiaomi seems to be third here, followed by Oppo and Vivo. Others is 32%. I don't know what that seems like a big number. I would have expected that to be lower, but maybe different parts, other parts of the world have local providers, local phones. I didn't check the African continent. I didn't check Latin America, for instance, quickly. So there could be other providers, either other small scale players in other countries that collectively take up 32%. But I don't know what. It doesn't look like there's any significant number, right? Because this doesn't show anything. Uh, it's surely less than 8%, but I don't know what that number is. Maybe it's less than 1% for each of those companies, and collectively it's 32%. Probably that is the case. I don't know. So that's, and then let's go to the Android market share. So now that we know that Apple's 20% in the world, but if you look at the overall, so it's 20% iPhones, which means iOS is 20% and Android is 80% across the globe. Of that 80%, you'll see here that Samsung has 25% of the market. Huge, right? They are the single largest player in the market. And then you have the Chinese makers, Xiaomi, Vivo, I think there's another one there, Oppo, Realme, and so on. And then Motorola has a 7% market share, which is not negligible. It's a pretty decent number. And Pixel's about 3%. And of the 3%, maybe most of it is in the US, maybe, possibly, and 35% is others, right? So within the 80% market share that Android has across the globe, Samsung is the single largest player. That's just amazing. So just keep that in mind as well. Now, let's say the third diagram I have here, the overall split, this says 70-30, but based on the first diagram that we saw, this should be 80-20. Again, these numbers can be a little bit off because if 30% of the overall mobile market is iOS, then that means 30% of that has to be iPhones, right? Because it cannot be anything else. So these numbers do seem a little bit contradictory because the global market shows 20% here. Oh, hang on. Maybe this is not just for iPhones. Maybe this is for other devices as well. That probably might make sense. It's probably for iPhones, iPads, and other iOS devices. Maybe then it becomes 30%, which is a much higher number, which makes sense because Apple sells a ton of iPads, as we all know. So that number probably includes, I'm pretty sure it includes other iOS devices. So that I pulled this up as well. Thanks to vividmaps.com. This is an incredible diagram. I don't know how much we can go through here, but let's just quickly humor ourselves. This has a breakdown by country, right? It essentially says the biggest market share for mobile devices. And if you go to North America, you see that US is pretty much iPhone 50%, but it should have Android for the other 50% as well. I don't know at some point. See, it says data reveals Apple controls close to a third of the global cell. Yeah, it says cell phone market. So maybe the previous diagram was, yeah, because I assume that this was iPads as well. But if it's cell phone, maybe it's just mobile devices. I mean, maybe just the phones themselves. I don't know. But those numbers are, these are, I've got these from different places, and maybe they're not exactly in sync, but you get the picture. There's no difference in the bigger picture here. So it goes with these mobile brands, and maybe it's only populating the largest ones. Yeah, I don't think it's plotting every one of them. It's just saying who has the largest market share. And no surprise, US and Canada, it's pretty much iPhones. Mexico, Samsung. Um, South America is pretty much Samsung, as we can see here. Wow, that's just amazing. All of Latin America, starting Mexico, which is in North America, but from there on, the rest of Latin America is basically except Venezuela, which has Xiaomi, right? So they have the Chinese brand in Venezuela, but the rest of Latin America is pretty much Samsung. Oh, all of Africa seems to be Samsung as well. I mean, most of Africa, I should say. And these might be, are they Techno? I don't know what Techno is. Oh, the parent company is based in China. See, again, this is again a Chinese phone, probably made. I'm sure. For instance, India, the market share for Android in India, I think it's about 97%, with only 3% market share for Apple. Of the 97%, I think the majority, if not almost all of them, not all of them, sorry. Let's actually look that up. I want to see the split between India, Android, Samsung market share. Oh, it's a third or a fourth player, 12 to 16% market share. So, which means I know if it's 97% Android phones and if it's only 12% Samsung, I'm quite certain that the rest of it is pretty much the Chinese brands. Now, they're all, I believe, manufactured locally in India using the Indian manufacturing ecosystem. But regardless, they are Chinese brands and Chinese phones that are being sold in India. So about 85% of 97% of India uses Android, and 85% of the 97%, which is if you took the overall number, it's still about 80, maybe 83, 84% of the entire market. Hang on. 97% of India uses Android. Of that, what is according to this number, 85% of it are Chinese phones. So I would say about 84% of every device, mobile device in India is one of the three or four Chinese makers, Vivo, Xiaomi, and Oppo. That's an incredible market share. They manufacture locally by Chinese companies and Chinese brands. Okay, so that was an interesting number. Now, if you look at, let's just quickly look at in India. Oh, it says Xiaomi. So the largest brand is Xiaomi, and probably closely followed by the other ones. And Spain happens to be Xiaomi as well. Um, Kazakhstan and Turkey, it seems to be Samsung. And then you see in Europe, not sorry, was I in Europe? Yep, you see all of Western Europe and even Eastern Europe and the Middle East. It's pretty much iPhones, right? iPhone is the largest provider. Um, we are seeing a pattern here: Taiwan, Japan, Australia. It's iPhones, and then the other. See, the emerging markets is generally Samsung, right? Because Samsung phones are more affordable. The markets where the per capita income and the GDPs are higher, it happens to be Apple, right? Apple phones are more expensive. So you can see that North America, Europe, I'm sorry, North America, particularly US and Canada, and then Western Europe and some Eastern Europe as well, and then Middle East and Australia happen to be iPhone has the highest market share. The rest of the world, Samsung has the higher market share, except for India, where Xiaomi seems to have the majority market share. And then there's other companies. We saw another one in Africa, but it's clearly a Chinese maker. making phones under a different brand, probably locally in that part of Africa. So that's how the phone market is split. So we're done with that page. Thanks to explodingtopics.com. Here is the active smartphone usage by country. China has, I think, about just shy of a billion people using smartphones. India has, what is this number? About 640 million people, give or take. So that means Indian population is 1.4 billion. This says active smartphone users is 620 billion. Seems to be a big gap there. Let's look that up quickly. Number of mobile phone users in India. It says India has over 1.1 billion connections, with estimates placing smartphone around 700 million, which means maybe the other 400 million phones are the non-smartphone devices. Number of non-smartphone. Yeah, hundreds of millions still use feature phones. What are feature phones? Are those the ones with the keypad and stuff? Yeah, okay, they're the phones of the past. So that's interesting. So about 400 million people in India are still not using smartphones. So there's a huge market there. Now, who's going to take that market? If is Apple able to take it? I mean, I don't think Apple's the first competitor there, because those are much cheaper phones, right? Let's say the price average. Let's check the average price of smartphone in India. So the average price of a smartphone in India is about 250 US dollars. The average price of a feature phone in India, so that's like about just shy of $10. So you have phones from under $10, correct? So remember this. These numbers are very, very interesting. Now we started the conversation with Apple and Google. We'll get there eventually, but let's focus on this for a moment. So China has about close to a billion smartphone users. India has about 600, a little bit higher, over the 600 million. They have about 400 million feature phone users. The US has about 300 million, pretty much everybody here, close to the entire population having smartphones. And then you have Indonesia, Brazil, Russia, Japan, and then you go through the list. So you take the largest, you take out of the 8 billion people in the world, 1 billion, 1.6, 2 billion, right? And then Indonesia is no small country. It's about 200 million people, and Brazil's about 150 million people. So if I do the math here, 1.6, 1.9, about 2 billion people, right? The 25% of the world using smartphones happens to live in four countries: China, India, US, and Indonesia. Now, when you talk about emerging markets, it's going to be Africa and it's going to be India as well, with the 400 million people who are going to most definitely switch from feature phones to smartphones in the next so many years. So there is a big market there for Android, for sure, right? That 400 million phones, I don't know how much of that Apple can really take. Apple's first bet is to go after the 640 million or whatever this number is smartphone users, because out of the 600, let's say it's 650 million, going by that line there, if it's 3%, 1% is 6 million, right? 6.5 million. So 3% is about 20 million people, 20 million phones. There are only 20 million iPhones in India. There are other out of the 650, 20 million phones are iPhones, and you add the other 400 million to make it a billion total number of actual phones in India, feature phones and iPhones included. uh, Out of a billion phones in India, only 20 million phones happen to be iPhones. Now, 100 million is 10% of a billion, 10 million is 1%, so 20 million is 2%. So Apple actually has less than a 2% market share of the overall phone market share in India. 98% of the other phones are running Android devices. That's an incredibly disproportionately huge number, and there's a lot of opportunity there. So Android, as we know, it is open source, but again owned by Alphabet. Now Android is owned by Alphabet. So 98% of India and 75% of the, let's say we saw 30 and then 20, so let's say 75% or upwards of that of the rest of the world is using Android as well. That's a massive market, right? You don't have like three different mobile players. You don't have Windows phones, right? You used to have them like 100 years ago, but surely we don't have them now. It's just split between iPhone and Android at a 20 30 or 20, a 20 80, 25 75, or a 30-70 ratio. Of that 75%, right, of the world using Android, Google has complete control because that's, even though it's open source, it's them, owning and running and managing that operating system. Now, if Apple was the sort of the only competitor there. Now, if Apple Siri ends up being dependent on Google Gemini, which I believe Google Gemini is probably going to be the same model that powers the Android phones as well, right? So let's look at that. Uh, do Siri equivalence on Android use Google Gemini models? The Gemini family of models powers the primary Siri equivalent on many Android devices. I mean, sure enough, that's what I expected. I just want to confirm that. So, which means now you'll have Google Gemini models powering pretty much every phone in the world. That's absolutely insane if you think about it. And the reason it's important is let's just momentarily switch gears for a second to OpenAI. Now, OpenAI and Google are lock, stock, and barrel competitors when it comes to the AI space, right? They are competing AI giants, but with varying, differing strategies, right? That's important to note. OpenAI focuses on mostly, for the most part, consumer-facing AI products, agents, and platforms and whatnot, like ChatGPT. It's leveraging and it's using its partnership with Microsoft in that regard. But Google has a very vast ecosystem, right? So it's Google has like so many products, right? Like search and YouTube and Android and Google Cloud and whatnot from an enterprise standpoint. And all of the work that they do when it comes to AI is going to help them at the enterprise level. So completely, if you look at B2C versus B2B, I might say that ChatGPT is, at least at this point, in the B2C space for the most part, if not entirely so. Whereas Google is in the B2B space, but they also are going to be, or probably already in the B2C space as well. So they are major competitors, but that's the difference. But let's also talk about the models. OpenAI has very rich AI models, but Google's not far behind, right? They've done extremely well in the last many months. We've gone from Google being questioned, their search being questioned from an existential crisis standpoint, to them going to becoming the second largest company in the world, right? They beat Apple to be the second largest company in the world, and in the last many weeks, which means they've done very well in the markets, rewarding them. They're seeing the power that they're going to have when it comes to AI and powering everything. We've just looked at AI on devices and how Gemini is going to play a massive role there. But if you take AI, Google's AI models and other AI products and services, they have a big suite of them. Look at that from an enterprise standpoint, that's going to be a massive number too. Collectively, you can just see how powerful that the strength is going to be. They have the powerful AI models, but when you combine them with their existing products and services, I mean, that's a sizably big, that's huge. So I want to say that they are probably maybe number two, if you even say they call OpenAI number one in the space of AI. But they're probably equal. The way I look at them, they're equal, and OpenAI is probably under threat, if you ask me, in my personal opinion, when it comes to Google. But of course, if OpenAI is going to have consumer products and devices that they're going to create that probably is going to compete with Apple's AirPods and whatnot. So we can probably have a different conversation around it at some point of time. But let's come back to numbers for a second. So $5 billion is what Alphabet is expected to get paid for, providing this powering Siri through Gemini AI models. That's, we saw that the Apple revenue was about $112 billion. So if you took 5 billion, that's about 4.5% of Apple's annual revenue. I mean, that's a big number. I mean, that's not a small number. It's not zero point 0.1 point or 0.2%. It's 4.5%. That's how much impact Apple's going to have. On the contrary, if Apple had actually built their own AI models and didn't have to rely on Google did not lag behind in the AI, in their leap to making improvements in the space of AI, they would have been able to save that 4.5% every single year. It's not a one-time fee, right? It's an annual fee. Now, that's what raises a question whether they're going to want to do this till the end of time, or are they going to be paying in the interim while they actually work on doing playing catch up. But playing catch up is no mean feat, especially with companies that are pretty much as big as each other. It's not a joke. Not just big. Alphabet ends up being bigger than Google. Sorry, bigger than Apple in this case, even though it's collectively with all divisions put together, right? It's with YouTube and Google Cloud and with all of their with Google Cloud, YouTube, search, the three main players, and then Waymo, which does I don't know if it's profit making right now, but they are hopefully going to generate some revenue as well. So it's not going to be easy to switch out. Plus, but our Apple strategy could actually be that they don't care to own every single thing that they do, and they've shown that in the past. They didn't build their own search engines. They've been using Google search and paying them handsome amounts of money, like $20 billion a year. So maybe they're open to partnering and collaborating with other big companies, and sort of delegating some part of what they do and not wanting to do everything themselves. The only contrary argument I can put forth here that I can think of from playing a devil's advocate is, they did buy these chips from the processors, from Intel for the longest periods of time, when till they moved out of it to have Apple's own processors, right? So Apple has these M1 chips and they've had them for a while. I mean, let's see when Apple's partnership with when did Apple's partnership when did Apple partnership with Intel end? It ended about, wow, it's almost 6 years now. Yeah, they transitioned to the Apple's silicon. So that's where and you can tell in the last 6 years. If you look at, let's quickly, just for curiosity's sakes, if I go to Intel here, if I go look up in the last 5 years, they're down 16%. While the S&P is up 84% in the last 5 years. Intel lost 16%. That's despite the fact that they've actually caught up quite a bit in the last 1 year. Given the localized manufacturing of GPUs. Again, I'm digressing, but if you ignore the last 1 year, if you just took the impact of Apple pulling out, it was an incredibly big number, right? So the Apple decided not to partner and create their own chips. That was basically, so Apple processors history. So I just want to see this quickly, right? It says 2000. Oh, it says first in-house design chip was in 2010, or used in iPads and iPhone 4. Okay, but what about? Yeah, but the partnership only ended in 2020, so maybe they used it on some of the devices, but not all. But essentially, the first Mac chip was in 2020. Oh, oh, you know what? Let me take it back. Let me take it back. Has Apple ever used Intel chips on iPhone? No, my bad. Okay, silly me. Apple's had their own chips on iPhones from day one. They just seized the partnership with with Intel. So MacBooks did not rely on it. That's basically what it is. So it goes here. The history. If you go back to the history, yep, the M series Max. The first chip was in 2020, and then since then they on all of their MacBooks and studios and whatnot, they have. Given that, I mean, maybe the impact. Now that I think about it, I attributed the entire impact of Intel's downfall in the last many years to Apple pulling out of MacBook. But MacBook is not the biggest revenue generator for Apple, so that may not have had that much of an impact. So maybe it was a combination of that and maybe other things as well. I'm not sure. Anyway, so that's the chip history. So the point I was trying to make here was that Apple did rely, even if not for the iPhones, but for other devices that they made, like their MacBooks, on other companies providing hardware and software. Like if you go to the, the App Store, obviously is another great example of Apple having its own apps, but of course it being a marketplace for other thousands, hundreds of thousands of other providers to publish their apps, with Apple monetizing handsomely, like 30% commission on the revenue that they generate on the in-app devices. But all that I was trying to make, the point I was trying to make there was that Apple has shown in the past that they can delegate and rely on other companies, and they are not anal about just doing every single thing themselves. But that being said, the fact that they didn't do this and they focus their energies on something like Vision Pro, which maybe it's close to being dead if it's not dead already, or the Apple Car that never came out, might be some decisions that they made that they probably regret, for all you know. Even large companies make big mistakes. So they just have the ability and the money to recover from them, and they're agile and they're smart enough to recover, but they have the ability to afford to make those. They can afford to make those mistakes in any case. So Apple might end up wanting to just pay endlessly, till the end of time, to Alphabet, and make that the provider for from an AI standpoint. The only thing that puts the doubt in my mind is, it's just Siri to get started with, but you can think about it, right? As more improvements are made from an iOS standpoint, from an OS X standpoint, there's going to be a lot more dependencies on AI and AI models. Now, if Apple becomes dependent on Alphabet for one of them to get started, are they going to then continually become dependent on Alphabet for everything that's AI related, for just about everything they do? Or are they going to partner with other companies potentially? Do they end up partnering with OpenAI, for instance, so they can keep Alphabet on a little bit of a check at least? Only time has to tell. Now, if I have to put the money, I have to say that Apple have to, maybe they've acknowledged the fact that they've lagged behind, and they probably it's going to take them a lot longer to catch up to the AI models, if they can ever do it. I'm sure they can, but it's probably going to take a lot more time. So they've decided to partner with Alphabet in the interim. But again, going back to the phone market, we've seen that Android has a 75% market share. I'm taking the average of the 70 and the 80. 75% global market share, and Google Gemini models are going to power Siri on iPhones, and the Siri equivalents on all of the other Android devices. It's becoming a little bit scary and monopolized, if you ask me, but that's where we are at this point. And I think that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. Let me make sure to see if I missed anything. I covered India as well. I mentioned that 97% of the market share is held by Android, with Samsung being the major player there. One tidbit, one thing, and small thing I forgot to mention was, so Samsung is the biggest player, right, when it comes to Android devices. But you probably know, I'm not a Samsung user, but I do know that Samsung has a layer of UI on top of, I think they call it One UI, on top of the Android release. So they're not using the vanilla out of the box Android releases from Google's trunk branch essentially, but they do follow that the trunk based development model, which means they're able to work on these versions as they become public essentially, and maybe even before they become public. Otherwise, if they waited for Android to hit the market, the newest version, and then and then Samsung's dev team has to go build that One UI that's compatible with the latest version of Android, then they're going to be playing catch up all the time, and it's not going to bode well for them. So they probably have a better model, a development model, which is quite interesting. I want to do a podcast on that at some point, where they can consume those releases in real time, even before they probably, maybe they create those feature branches off of the trunk branch, the Android branch, so they can start building the One UI layer even before Android's actually officially launched. Google's launched the next official version of Android, for instance. So that's from a development standpoint. And just like Samsung, I'm sure all the other Android phones, not all, but probably most of the other ones, have their own layer on top. As to how rich or how thick or how different that the layer on atop the Android release is, probably is different between these phones. But I'm pretty sure Xiaomi or Vivo also have something similar to One UI to create that separation. Otherwise, all phones are going to look identical, right? They cannot afford to look that way, and I'm sure Google's Pixel has its own layer atop the Android version as well. So that's, I think, essentially what I wanted to, a bunch of things I want to talk about and cover. This news is again interesting for every reason we've talked about and not talked about in this podcast. Let me know what you think. How do you think the partnership is going to work? Is it going to be short term between Apple and Google when it comes to being Siri being powered by Gemini AI models, or do you expect that to be long term? What kind of impact do you think it's going to have? The $5 billion is what I'm seeing right now in terms of the annual fee that Google has to pay. Sorry, Apple has to pay Google. Do you think that's going to continue? And what about other Apple devices and other operating systems like OS X? Are they also going to start leveraging Google AI models to power their features and whatever it is that they want to support in future? Or are they going to partner possibly with other providers like OpenAI? So there is some level of competition. They're not dependent on a single vendor. And do you expect Apple to start working on their own Apple AI models? How feasible do you think it is, having lost a year or two or three into where we are at in 2026? Is Apple going to play catch up for a long time? What could their strategies potentially be, and how excited are you about some of these things that are happening in this space? That's it for now, and hopefully you've learned a thing or two more than what you already did know about what's happening here. And definitely don't forget to check us out, not just the API, but go to products.snowpal.com as well. Right, I'm going to write it down here. So, oops, I have to go to the right, um, the right window. That's fine. I have to find that window. So just go to products.snowpal.com, and that's our homepage, and you can see our other products, the mobile app, the web app, our education platform. So if you're a course creator who wants to create a course on something like what we even just talked about here, you're welcome to publish that on our platform, and you keep 80% of the revenue that your course generate or your courses generate, and we keep the other 20%, the smaller number, to fund our expenses and see a bit of a margin there. That's it. Hope you enjoyed this podcast. I'll talk soon. Bye bye.